I will try to present environmental models in food industry in the next 30 minutes. As you probably know, these models are very present in the food industry, and it's a very wide research area. So I'll try to give some ideas how to evaluate the environmental models existing in the food industry. Just a short, brief explanation where I come from. I come from the Faculty of Agriculture, University of Belgrade, and it's organized in about 30 departments and 8 institutes, and I come from the Department of Food Safety and Quality Management. This department is in charge of developing various food models for food quality, food safety, and environment in food industry. So my area of research is mainly in the quality and environmental field. So I will try to present some ideas we have regarding environmental models and what is the state of the art of the present topic we are talking about. So environmental models are actually developed to help us study the effects of various food industries and food systems and the processes that exist within the food systems and how they actually affect the environment. So they actually can help us in calculating on one side what happened before, meaning that we can analyze the past environmental impacts, and based on the models we can predict what can be some future environmental outcomes that we can expect developing certain food technologies or certain food products. Regarding some definitions, the US Environmental Protection Agency states that these models should help us improve the understanding of the environment and how it reacts to changing conditions. Basic changing conditions are either exposure to some contamination, some hazardous substances, or use of natural resources like fossil fuels or water or other resources that we use when we produce food. Depending on the area of research, we can analyze and actually define 3 dimensions where we can look at these environmental models. The first dimension is the dimension of the product. That means we analyze a certain product, let's say a chocolate or a dairy product like milk or meat or whatever we prefer, and we analyze what environmental impacts occur during the production of this certain product. So this is one area of research. The other areas of research is when we, let's say, analyze some processes that exist in the food industry, and we analyze how these processes impact on the environment. And the third dimension is the dimension when we analyze the company and we see how this company actually implements certain environmental practices. That means that we analyze what is the environmental management system existing in the certain food company. So I will start with the first dimension, the dimension of food. The well-known and the most common used environmental model is called life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is a system, is a concept where we analyze the entire life cycle of the product. In the international standards and literature, it's called the cradle-to-grave concept. That means we analyze everything that happens with the food during its transformation from the raw material to the final product. And it's usually divided in 3 subsystems. First subsystem is called cradle to gate. The second is called gate to gate, and the third is called gate to disposal. This means that we can, let's say, analyze a dairy processing plant, and the cradle to gate study will analyze what happens with the raw milk before it comes to the dairy plant. The gate to gate study will analyze what happens with the milk during its transformation from raw milk to certain dairy products like cheese or yogurt, and what happens in that dairy plant concerning environmental impacts. And the third area of research is gate to disposal, meaning that we analyze what happens with the product, with the product when it leaves the dairy plant. That means goes to retail and comes to consumers. And of course, we have to take into account the disposal of packaging where the product was packed in. This is the concept well known and recognized in the international standard ISO 14040. But this also, for the people that are in the food industry, somehow it's very similar to the farm to the fork concept that is used in food safety, meaning that we have to analyze what happens with the product during its entire life. Based on the life cycle assessment and outlined in the standard, we have actually four things we have to define. First, we have to define the goal and scope of the research. That means we have to analyze, will we actually take into account the entire life cycle, or we can shorten it and look at certain parts of the life cycle. That means we can, let's say, only analyze what happens at the farm and what happens in the dairy plant, and not analyzing what happens when it comes to the retail and when it comes to us as consumers. That means we can widen or shorten the perspective of the entire life cycle, depending, can we obtain certain information, that means certain inventory that we should calculate within the mathematical model. The inventory analysis is actually analyzing of the inputs and outputs that occur within the systems we analyze in the life cycle assessment. The impact assessment is a very interesting part because it helps us analyze what are the certain impacts. Developing these mathematical models, we can see that there are a huge number of different kinds of interpretation. What are the certain environmental impacts? This is on one side helpful if we want to develop a product, but the challenging part is the interpretation. What is the functional unit in which we actually present the information? This is important for others to compare their results. So typically functional unit is 1 kilogram of final product, but in certain cases, depending on the subsystems that were analyzed, certain scientists actually present the functional units. Let's say if we have raw milk, then we can interpret it as 1 liter of raw milk. Or if we have meat, we can interpret it as, let's say, 1 kilogram of carcass. So depending on the function unit, we have to actually transform the data to present it in a manner that everybody can compare the results. So here is a generic system of dairy production. If we, let's say, analyze only 2 subsystems, dairy farm and dairy plant, then our subsystem would actually analyze only what happens within these 2 subsystems, and we can include a third subsystem called waste and wastewater, because in both subsystems we have these 2 environmental impacts. If we want to widen it up, we should take into account, let's say, what happens during transportation of feed, of cleaning agents, of packaging materials, and also we should include the electricity that's needed for the production of any kind of dairy product. Out of the scope at this generic model is, let's say, feed production, which is also very important, but it's usually taken out of analyzing the dairy products. Second part is retail, and the third part is what happens when we take the products at home. So in this presentation, you can see that actually we have widened our scope. We analyzed only the dairy farm and dairy plant and excluded retail, household, and feed production, meaning that if we want, we can expand it, and that's the goal and the scope of our life cycle assessment. So speaking about these life cycle assessment models, we see here that the number of scientific publications related to life cycle assessment is increasing from year to year. But researchers are always seeking to find what is the best model. So here we can actually see from a very good review paper that we have over 25 life cycle assessment methodologies, and every methodology has their own calculation and their own environmental impact. For some life cycle assessment methodologies, there are up to 20 different outputs that we can calculate using this type of model. So looking at this life cycle assessment, we can analyze, let's say, how can we transform the data we get from, let's say, analyzing the environmental impact, and we can deploy them on different environmental impacts. We can analyze the fossil fuel depletion, depletion of materials, emission of greenhouse gases, ozone layer depletion, and so on. That means that we can actually transform the environmental impacts into quantitative numbers, meaning that we can calculate actually what is the environmental impact. Further, we can analyze them in terms of, let's say, do they affect natural resources, or do they affect human health or the ecosystems? Meaning that we can transform the raw environmental impacts into certain calculative damages to the resources, human health, and ecosystem. And of course, we can further then develop them as certain environmental performance indicators, meaning that we can compare them with similar food industries that occur in the area where we are actually researching. So this is a typical output of environmental impact assessment. And here you can see a study that was performed in 7 dairy plants. And depending on the technological level of the dairy plants, we see that some of the units actually, there is a range of results we got depending on the dairy plant. For, let's say, global warming potential, we have received from 1.25 to 1.67 kilograms of CO2, meaning that for 1 kilogram of dairy product, there is an emission of 1.25 kilograms of CO2. And for the other environmental impacts, you can see also the results. So this is a typical output that we get when we use this type of environmental models called life cycle assessment. But when we analyze these results, there are some challenges we have when we want to compare the results. Here, there is a table showing several authors that analyze the environmental impact of poultry production. Depending on which system boundaries they were actually analyzing and what environmental impact, we see that some results maybe are not fully comparable. What does that mean? That means that we have 5 subsystems. Somebody only analyzed the poultry farm, the others analyzed slaughterhouses or retail or meat processing plant. And depending what they were doing, they actually developed their own environmental impacts, global warming potential, acidification, ozone depletion, and so on. Meaning that there is no unique methodology and what should be the outputs. It depends on the methodology, on the industry, on the scope of the life cycle assessment. So there are also some certain constraints in unifying this methodology. And the third thing also very important, what were the functional units? Was it 1 kilogram of final products, of carcass, of live animal, and so on. Regarding processes, this is another approach. In this approach, we actually analyze what happens during a certain production. So this is a generic model of meat production where we have inputs and outputs. And if we want to focus not on the product, but on the processes, that means that we should analyze which processes are of our interest. Meaning that we can actually develop these models as top-down models, meaning we analyze one process and analyze impacts generated from one technological process in food industry. And the other approach is the so-called bottom-up approach, where we analyze a certain environmental impact and go from the bottom to up and analyze all processes that affect the certain environmental impact. So a typical food industry process is, let's say, cleaning and sanitation. This is a prerequisite program in food safety, meaning that every food company has to have a certain standard sanitation operational procedure, meaning that they have to clean and sanitize their work environment. During the food processing, the production schedule is usually affected by the product changes, meaning that each time there is a change in the product that is produced, there has to be a cleaning operation, cleaning in place or whatever is implemented in a certain company. So these models enable, on one side, optimization of the changeovers from one product to the other in respect to lower environmental impacts. And we see some papers that were dealing with this problem, analyzing how can we reduce use of cleaning agents, improve the wastewater quality, decrease the use and the consumption of water, and decrease the amount of waste. The other approach is if we analyze certain environmental footprints or impacts. Let's say carbon footprint. That means that we should analyze what processes affect emission of greenhouse gases, or let's say water footprint, emission footprint, and so on. There is a large number of different footprints developed by certain authors. And here I just presented the most common used in food industry. And this is also taken from a good review paper showing us that there are over 100 tools and mathematical models dealing with different environmental footprints. Depending what is our focus, we implement the bottom-up approach and say, okay, we want to analyze how we consume energy for the energy footprint and go back to all processes and see how can we actually improve the energy management within a certain company. And the third level is the level of the systems, where we analyze actually what are the environmental management systems implemented and in place in a certain food company. Just a brief overview of the development of environmental management system. It actually started back in the 1970s, and the British standard was actually the draft basis for developing the ISO 14001 as the most famous and most recognized environmental management system standard, and it had 3 revisions. The latest revision was from 2015. So what do the researchers show us? They were analyzing what happens before implementing a certain environmental management system in a food company, what are the outcomes during implementation, and what are the outcomes when certain environmental management system has been implemented. So basically the topics were either drivers, why to implement, what were the costs, and what were the benefits and effects of implemented and certified environmental management systems. How did they do it? The methodology is something that should be discussed, and there is no unified methodology. Basically, companies were analyzed regarding the standard ISO 14001 or certain environmental aspects. How did they implement certain environmental management procedures and so on? Also, we have a good case study of analyzing intellectual capital related to environmental management in certain companies, like as I stated here. And the techniques, they were either on-site visits, interviews by phone, or online questionnaires. This raises certain challenges. The challenges are, what is the competence of people that are actually evaluating the environmental practice in a certain company? The other challenges, are all assessors calibrated to see the same environmental problem with the same, actually to grade it in the same way? Competence of auditors and assessors is a very interesting thing, because we have to actually train them when they go to a company and they see certain environmental practice to actually grade them in the same way. Usually the instruments are either checklists or questionnaires, where we actually evaluate them from on an interval scale from, let's say, 0 to 5. 0 is non-compliance and 5 is full compliance of a certain environmental practice. So these are the challenges, because there is no unique methodology how to actually evaluate the level of environmental practices in food companies. So here, this is a brief overview of some papers. What were actually the findings of this type of research, meaning what were the drivers, what were the costs, and what were the benefits and effects of implemented and certified systems? In general, there are 2 types of companies. one type of company implement certain environmental management system basically because it's a pressure from the market. Either their consumers want it, or it's something important for the tenders or to get a job. So this is a so-called paper-driven certification, where they actually only implement a certain standard because they have to benefit from customers and they have to get some new jobs. The other group of companies are companies that are really dedicated to environmental improvements, and they implement these systems because they want to prevent pollution and improve, let's say, legal compliance and overall environmental performance. So these are two types of companies. Other models, just to show you one, is a model that was actually analyzing environmental practices in meat companies, in slaughter companies and meat processing companies, where actually methodology was used from the United Kingdom, and it was slightly modified, where we analyzed energy consumption, water consumption, waste management, and wastewater treatment in terms of how actually the companies take care of these environmental impacts, since these environmental impacts are the most important impacts in meat industry. So this is some model that was developed for this purpose. So as a conclusion, what are the future challenges? Basically, as you probably saw, there is no typical environmental model for the food industry, because basically all environmental models, either if it's a life cycle assessment model or it's a model for environmental management system where ISO 14000 is a generic standard, all these models are generic and they're not dedicated to food industry, meaning that we have to implement certain specifications that are only typical for food industry and try to develop our own models. One of the main problems we have is the confrontation of food safety and environment, because these two, in some occasions, are not working in parallel, meaning that if we want to take care of food safety, then we pollute the environment in a much higher degree. And also food quality is there as a good and important input. So I just wanted as an idea how to develop other environmental models in food industry, to give you three interesting topics. First topic is climate and effect of climate change on food safety. Here are some papers that were recently published regarding analysis of climate change and how it affects actually food safety. The other models are models related to food packaging. Food packaging is an industry that's very intensive in its development. We have intelligent packaging, we have packaging that enables a longer shelf life of a product, meaning that the quality and food safety of product will stay as much as we want during its shelf life period. On the other side, we have the environmental impact of food packaging. So this is an area of very interesting research. I just highlighted some. You see the latest one in 2017. And the third is transportation, because we know that we have many products that, especially food products, that travel all over the world. So in the United Kingdom and the United States, there was developed a methodology called food miles, where we actually calculate the amount of kilometers of miles that the product takes from its, when it's actually raised on a farm, until it reaches its final customer. In some calculations, it states that it's about 1,000 kilometers, the average food mile of a product, meaning that if we consume local products, that the food mile is much lower than if we consume products that are imported from other countries. So this is also an interesting environmental model specifically developed for food industry. So this was actually what I plan to present in this short presentation. It's about 25 minutes, I think. So if there are some questions, I'm here and I will try to answer them. Thank you.